He fired her in front of everyone and froze when the new owner of his company was the black woman he once loved. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The late afternoon sun, filtered through the towering glass windows of the open-plan office, cast long, distorted shadows across the polished concrete floor. It was the kind of Friday afternoon where the air felt thick with a quiet, collective anticipation for the weekend. The rhythmic clatter of keyboards and the low, muffled conversations created a familiar oral backdrop to the hum of the central air conditioning, but that sense of normalcy was about to be shattered. All eyes in the sprawling office began to turn toward the central bullpen area, where a figure stood, commanding the space with his mere presence. Marcus, the newly appointed regional director, was a man who moved with a calculated swagger, a confident stride honed in boardrooms and power lunches. Today, his smirk was particularly pronounced, a small, triumphant curve on his lips that hinted at something more than routine business. He clapped his hands once sharply, and the office fell silent. The conversations died, and the keyboards went still. "Good afternoon, everyone," he announced, his voice carrying an artificial warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I just wanted to take a moment to address the team. As you all know, we're entering a new era, a time of change, growth, and most importantly, innovation." His gaze swept over the sea of faces, a predatory glint in his eye as he scanned for his target. He saw the nervous shuffling in their seats, the quick darting glances between colleagues. He knew they all felt it, the palpable tension he'd so carefully orchestrated. He relished the power of it, the feeling of being in complete control, but his focus wasn't on the timid or the anxious. It was on one specific person. Ava, a lead programmer who had been with the company for 5 years, was a figure of quiet competence. She was known for her elegant code, her sharp analytical mind, and her unflappable demeanor. She sat at her desk, engrossed in a complex problem, her dark hair pulled back from her face, a pair of subtle silver earrings catching the light. She was oblivious to the drama unfolding around her, a bubble of concentration that was Marcus's sole focus to pop. He sauntered closer to her desk, his expensive leather shoes making a soft, deliberate thud on the floor. "And with change," he continued, his voice now lower, more menacing, "come difficult decisions. Some people, for all their past contributions, simply aren't suited for the future we're building." Ava finally looked up. Her eyes, a rich, deep brown, met his. There was no fear in them, only an open, questioning curiosity. She saw him standing over her, the way the light caught his immaculately tailored suit, and for a fleeting second, a memory of a different Marcus flashed through her mind, a man she had once loved, whose ambition had been a quality she admired, not one she had learned to fear. The memory was quickly replaced by the cold reality of the present. Marcus leaned forward, his voice a low, brutal whisper that everyone in the quiet office could still hear. "Ava, your performance metrics have been, frankly, subpar." It was a blatant, calculated lie. The entire department knew it. Ava had single-handedly salvaged 2 major projects in the past year, and her team consistently delivered ahead of schedule. The silence in the office deepened. A young intern a few cubicles over audibly gasped, quickly clamping a hand over her mouth. Ava's mentor, a kind-faced woman named Alina, looked at Marcus with undisguised disgust but said nothing. The fear was a living thing in the room, stifling any dissent. Ava's face, however, remained a mask of professional calm. The only sign of her internal turmoil was a slight tensing of her jaw. She had watched Marcus climb the corporate ladder, a steady ascent fueled by ambition and a growing lack of empathy. She had seen him become a stranger, but this was a new level of personal cruelty. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I believe there may be a misunderstanding. My most recent performance review was exemplary, and my team's project is on track to be completed 3 weeks early." Marcus's smirk widened, his face hardening with a smug satisfaction. He loved this. He loved the public contradiction, the chance to squash her, to show everyone that her past successes meant nothing to him. "Your numbers don't align with our new company vision, Ava. We need people who can push boundaries, not just meet expectations. Effective immediately, your position has been eliminated." The words were like a physical blow, not just to Ava but to the entire room. Marcus hadn't simply fired her, he had publicly humiliated her, using baseless lies to justify an act of personal vengeance. The casual cruelty of his tone was a deliberate barb meant to sting, to belittle. He had wanted to see her crumble, to plead, to show a flash of the vulnerability he remembered. But Ava did none of those things. Her eyes, which had been so calmly focused on his face, now held a new, unreadable glint. It wasn't hurt and it wasn't tears. It was something far more dangerous to him, a cold, hard resolve. She slowly rose from her chair, her movements deliberate and controlled. She didn't look at anyone else in the room. She simply reached for her laptop, closed it with a soft click, and began to pack her personal belongings into a small canvas bag. Each action was a silent act of defiance, a refusal to give him the reaction he so desperately craved. As she walked toward the exit, the only sound was the soft, dignified tapping of her heels on the floor, a beat of professional grace in a room filled with corporate betrayal. The silence that followed Ava's departure was not a void, but a weight. It pressed down on the cubicles and conference tables, making the air heavy and thick. Every eye in the office remained fixed on the space where she had been, as if her presence still lingered, a ghost of professionalism and competence. The rhythmic, confident tapping of her heels faded away, leaving behind a profound quiet that was far more deafening than the sound had been. Marcus stood there for a long moment, watching the glass doors slide shut behind her. A twisted sense of victory swelled in his chest, a bitter, satisfying rush of adrenaline. He had done it. He had asserted his authority, shown everyone what happened to people who didn't fit into his new world order. More than that, he had finally settled a decade-old score. He ran his tongue over his teeth, the taste of success metallic and sharp. He told himself it was a strategic move, a necessary act to instill discipline and prove he was a decisive leader. He had to be ruthless to get to the top, didn't he? But as he looked around at the faces staring back at him, the victorious high began to sour. The silence was not one of respect, but of shock and a cold, silent judgment. No one was rushing to get back to work. A few people slowly lowered their gazes, avoiding eye contact, but Marcus could feel their disapproval like a physical thing. He saw the genuine look of sorrow on Aliner's face, Ava's mentor, and the bewildered, angry eyes of the young intern. The atmosphere in his kingdom was no longer one of quiet productivity, but one of fear and disgust. The victory felt hollow. He turned on his heel and strode back to his glass-walled corner office, slamming the door shut with a finality that made a few people jump. He sank into his leather chair, the expensive upholstery offering no comfort. His eyes fell on a framed photograph on his desk, a photo of him shaking hands with the CEO. The image, meant to symbolize his ascent, now just looked like a monument to his own petty cruelty. A memory, unbidden and sharp, flickered behind his eyes. Ava, a decade younger, sitting across from him in a tiny apartment, her face alight with excitement as she talked about her dreams for a new programming language. She had always been brilliant, always had a quiet, burning ambition that he had loved and then ultimately resented. Their relationship had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, persistent fizzle, a slow erosion of connection fueled by his own insecurities about her growing success. He had always seen her as a competitor, even back then. Firing her today had been the ultimate delayed act of revenge, a final assertion of his dominance. But the taste of victory was turning to ash in his mouth. He realized with a sickening lurch that he hadn't just fired a brilliant employee, he had just burned the last bridge to a part of his life he had never truly made peace with. He felt a deep, unsettling emptiness where the triumph was supposed to be. Meanwhile, Ava was out in the sun-drenched city. The blast of warm air as she stepped out of the building was a stark contrast to the air-conditioned tomb she had just left. She clutched the straps of her bag, the weight of her laptop, and the small plant she had rescued from her desk, a reassuring, tangible anchor. She had walked with her head held high, refusing to give in to the shame or the tears that threatened to well up. She had maintained her dignity, and that, she told herself, was the one thing Marcus couldn't take from her. The city was loud and vibrant, a sensory assault that helped to push the memory of the past 20 minutes to the back of her mind. The blare of a horn, the distant siren, the murmur of 100 different conversations all around her. It was a symphony of life that had no room for Marcus's petty drama. But even as she walked, the words echoed in her head. Subpar, not aligned with our new company vision. They were hollow words, corporate buzzwords used to dress up a personal vendetta. She knew it, and so did everyone else. Her anger, which had been a quiet, burning ember, began to flare into a raging fire. She unlocked her apartment door, and the silence of her home was a welcome relief. She placed her bag on the floor, the little green plant on her kitchen counter, and stared at it for a moment. It was a succulent, hardy, and resilient, just like her, she thought, a small, wry smile touching her lips. The tears finally came, not from hurt, but from a profound and overwhelming sense of injustice. They weren't tears of a victim, but of a fighter. As she sat on her sofa, the tears slowly subsided, and the raw emotion gave way to a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just a moment of shame, it was a clear-cut case of wrongful termination. Marcus had used his position of power to humiliate her, to lie about her performance, and she had evidence to prove it. She pulled out her phone, her fingers steady as she scrolled through her contacts. She found the number she was looking for and took a deep, fortifying breath. "Aliner," she said into the phone, her voice calm and resolute. "I need your help. Marcus just fired me, and I need to gather all the documentation I can. This isn't over." The plan was already forming in her mind, a quiet, meticulous blueprint for retribution. This wasn't just about getting a settlement. It was about exposing Marcus for the fraud he was, about reclaiming her dignity, and about showing him that the woman he thought he could destroy was a force he had grossly underestimated. Her heart, once heavy with humiliation, now thrummed with a focused, vengeful energy. She had been publicly humiliated, but in that moment of defeat, she had found a new, unstoppable purpose. This was her new beginning, and Marcus would soon find out what it truly meant to be on the other side of her ambition. First stop for Ava after she left the office was not a place of comfort, but a deliberate destination fueled by a cold, hard resolve. She didn't go home to wallow or to allow herself to be swallowed by the humiliation. Instead, she took a taxi to a quiet, tree-lined street a few miles away, a neighborhood of brick facades and polished brass nameplates. The building she sought was unassuming, a two-story structure of red brick with a discreet sign that read, Henderson and Associates, Legal Counsel. It was a firm recommended to her by a former colleague, a place known for handling corporate disputes with quiet efficiency. The waiting room was a study in professional calm. The air was cool and smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee. Unlike the chaotic, fear-ridden bullpen she had just left, this was a place of order and control. Ava sat on a leather couch, her hands clasped in her lap, her composure a shield against the turmoil inside. She wasn't just a former employee, she was now a client, a person with rights and a clear case. A woman with a sharp, intelligent face and a warm smile finally came to greet her. "Ava, I'm Ms. Henderson. Please come on in." Ava followed her into an office dominated by a large mahogany desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Ms. Henderson gestured to a chair and settled into her own, her gaze steady and reassuring. "Tell me what happened," she said simply, her voice devoid of judgment. As Ava began to recount the events of the last hour, the story tumbled out with a clarity she hadn't known she possessed. She described the public nature of the firing, the fabricated reasons Marcus had given, and the stunned silence of the office. She spoke about her 5 years of dedicated work, her stellar performance reviews, and the numerous emails she had received from clients praising her work. She spoke not with emotion, but with a factual, precise tone, as if she were a witness recounting a crime. Ms. Henderson listened, her head tilted, a pen moving in a slow, deliberate circle on her legal pad. "And you have documentation to support all of this?" she asked when Ava paused. "I do," Ava confirmed. "I have every performance review from the past 5 years, all of them positive. I have copies of the 2 major projects I spearheaded that came in under budget and ahead of schedule. I even have an email from Marcus himself, sent just last week, praising me for a fix I found on the client-facing platform." His words were, "Ava, this is exactly the kind of innovative work that makes this company great." It's a direct contradiction to what he said today. Ms. Henderson's pen stopped circling. A slow, thoughtful smile spread across her face. "That, Ava, is a smoking gun. A public, baseless firing combined with documented proof of excellent performance and a recent contradictory statement from the person who fired you. This is a very strong case. He didn't just terminate your employment. He committed a wrongful dismissal, likely in a way that could be interpreted as defamation, and he did it in front of a dozen witnesses." The lawyer's words were like a bracing tonic. For the first time since Marcus's cruel announcement, Ava felt a genuine surge of something other than humiliation. It was a righteous anger, a cold, focused fire burning in her belly. This wasn't just about getting back at Marcus. It was about exposing him, about standing up for herself and her worth. This wasn't just a personal injustice, but a systemic one. "I don't just want my job back," Ava said, the words surprising even herself with their vehemence. "I want him to pay for what he did. I want to show him that he can't treat people like that." Ms. Henderson nodded slowly, her expression now one of professional admiration. "Good," she said. "That's exactly the kind of resolve we need for a case like this. We're not just seeking a settlement, we're fighting for justice. We're going to hit him where it hurts most, his professional reputation and his company's bottom line." They spent the next hour going over the plan. The first step was a formal demand letter, a meticulously worded document that would be sent to the company's board of directors, not to Marcus directly. It would outline the facts, present the evidence, and demand not only compensation for wrongful termination, but also a public apology and reinstatement. The letter would be a warning shot, a clear message that Ava was not going away quietly. It was a strategic move, designed to bypass Marcus's arrogance and put the pressure on the company to make a decision before things escalated further. "And what happens if they refuse?" Ava asked, a new sense of power settling over her. "Then we proceed with a lawsuit," Ms. Henderson said, "and based on the evidence you have, I would say our chances of a significant victory are very high." As Ava walked out of the law office, the world seemed to have changed. The city outside was still a cacophony of sound and movement, but she no longer felt lost in it. She felt grounded, purposeful. She had entered the office a victim, someone who had been publicly scorned and dismissed. She left with a plan, a lawyer, and a newfound sense of power. The fire that had been lit inside her was no longer a flicker of hurt, but a steady, white-hot flame of purpose. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. It was about proving her worth, not to Marcus, but to herself and the world. She wasn't just fighting to get her old life back. She was fighting to build a new one where a man like Marcus could no longer stand in her way. The path ahead was clear, and she was ready to walk it. The weeks that followed Ava's public firing settled into a quiet, uneasy calm. To Marcus, it felt like a victory. The office, once a place of collaborative energy, now operated with a hushed efficiency. The nervous obedience he had instilled was a direct result of his brutal act, and he mistook it for respect. He had finally cemented his position as the undisputed king of his small tech kingdom, and he savored every moment of it. He filled the vacancy left by Ava with a fresh-faced, eager-to-please young man named Kyle. Kyle's inexperience was his greatest asset in Marcus's eyes. He was moldable, easily controlled, and his every suggestion was a thinly veiled compliment to Marcus's genius. Marcus would hold court in his glass-walled office, watching the new, quieter rhythm of the company with a smug satisfaction. He saw the employees, their heads down, their keyboards clicking steadily, and he believed they were working harder than ever, driven by the fear of becoming the next Ava. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he was missing the crucial nuance. Their productivity was born not of inspiration, but of a quiet, simmering resentment. They didn't innovate, they simply followed orders, afraid to take risks or speak their minds. The company's creative spark, the very thing that had made it so successful, was slowly and systematically being extinguished. He was blind to the subtle signs of decay. The project that Ava had been leading was now behind schedule, and Kyle, terrified of Marcus's temper, was providing him with overly optimistic reports. Customer satisfaction scores were quietly dipping, and the best employees were beginning to update their resumes in secret. Marcus, however, was in a bubble of his own making, a world where his decisions were infallible and his authority absolute. Then the whispers began. They started in the kitchen during quick coffee breaks and spread through the chat channels like a virus, rumors of a potential acquisition. Marcus first heard them as he was walking past two junior developers who quickly fell silent as he approached. He dismissed it with a wave of his hand, a disdainful scoff. "Just office gossip," he told his assistant later. "We're not for sale." He was sure of it. As the regional director, he would have been the first to know. The very thought that a new owner could be on the horizon, someone who might threaten his hard-won power, was unthinkable. He felt an almost physical resistance to the idea. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The rumors became more specific. A large, unnamed company was finalizing a deal. A sense of unease began to creep into Marcus's once unshakable confidence. He found himself scrolling through his emails, looking for some hint, some clue, but there was nothing. He tried to call the CEO, but his calls went to voicemail. The feeling of being out of the loop was a cold, unfamiliar sensation. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of the powerlessness he had experienced before his promotion. His fear finally crystallized into a single, terrifying moment. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and his inbox pinged with a new message. The subject line, bolded and uncomfortably direct, read, "Mandatory all-hands meeting, new leadership." His heart lurched, a cold fist of dread closing around it. The email was from the company's corporate communications department, not his direct superior. It was short, a single paragraph confirming the rumors were true. An acquisition was complete, and the new owner would be introduced to the team this Friday afternoon. No names, no specifics, just the promise of an unchangeable reality. The carefully constructed world Marcus had built began to crumble in that instant. His arrogance was replaced by a churning paranoia. Who was this new owner? Did they know about his recent actions? Did they know about the wrongful termination, the hostile work environment he had created? His public firing of Ava, which had felt so good at the time, now felt like an enormous, looming mistake, a stain on his professional record that he couldn't erase. He spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended animation, going through the motions of his job but unable to focus. He tried to find out who the new owner was, making frantic calls to contacts, but they were all in the dark. The secrecy of the deal made the tension in the office unbearable. Friday afternoon arrived, a day that felt less like a celebration of the end of the work week and more like a trip to the gallows. The office was abuzz with a nervous energy that he couldn't suppress. People huddled in small, anxious groups, whispering theories. The confident, swaggering Marcus was gone, replaced by a man pacing his office, his mind racing. He tried to craft a speech in his head, a way to sell himself to the new leadership, to prove his value and save his position. He mentally rehearsed all the ways he could spin the past few months, highlighting his leadership and decisive action. He even considered what he would say if Ava's name came up, a quick, practiced lie to downplay the incident. But the more he thought about it, the more his fear grew. He looked at her old desk, now occupied by a timid Kyle, and the public spectacle he had created played over and over in his mind like a silent film. He had been so convinced of his power then, so certain of his righteous cruelty. Now, that same conviction felt like a ticking time bomb. When the time for the meeting finally arrived, Marcus walked to the conference room with a forced bravado he didn't feel. He could feel the eyes of his employees on him, the same eyes that had watched him fire Ava. He knew they were all wondering the same thing. Was he about to get what was coming to him? He pushed the door open, his heart pounding in his chest, ready to face the music. The room was packed with his entire team, their faces a mixture of fear and nervous anticipation. He took his place at the head of the table, a man who had built a kingdom on a foundation of sand, completely unprepared for the storm that was about to break. The conference room was a pressure cooker of anticipation. Marcus stood at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, a position he had always cherished as a symbol of his power and authority. He tried to project an air of calm control, a difficult feat given the frantic churning in his stomach. He was meticulously dressed, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back, but his mind was racing. He kept replaying his mental script for the new owner, a confident, humble yet assertive introduction of his leadership and his plans for the company's future. He had to prove his worth, to sell himself as the irreplaceable figurehead of this division. But the silence of the room, punctuated by the nervous coughs and the rustling of a few papers, was a constant, unnerving reminder that his fate was no longer in his hands. The tension was a tangible thing, a heavy cloud that hung over every employee in the room. They too were waiting for the inevitable. They watched him with a mixture of apprehension and a quiet, hungry curiosity. Their collective fear of him, a fear he had carefully cultivated, was now intertwined with their own fear of the unknown. They all knew this moment was a reckoning, not just for the company, but for the man who had so publicly and ruthlessly wielded his power. Then the door opened. All heads turned in unison. A man in a simple gray suit, a corporate lawyer from the parent company, stepped inside. He was a familiar face, and his presence was a temporary, fleeting relief. The lawyer walked to the side of the table, holding a sleek tablet. He gave a small, unreadable smile. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you all for being here. As you know, our company has undergone a recent acquisition. I am pleased to introduce you to the new owner. She will be leading us into a new era of growth and innovation." The lawyer gestured to the door. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He had been so focused on the lawyer that he hadn't even realized the door had remained open. He turned his head, his eyes widening in a mixture of hope and dread. A woman walked in. Her presence was a physical force. She wasn't simply entering a room, she was claiming it. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored, charcoal gray pantsuit that fit her perfectly, a subtle display of power and grace. Her hair, which he had only ever seen flowing freely, was pulled back into a sleek, professional bun that accentuated the sharp, intelligent angles of her face. She held herself with an unshakable confidence, her spine straight, her stride deliberate and commanding. The air in the room, already thick with tension, seemed to suck itself into a vacuum. The silence was absolute. Marcus's world stopped. The polished conference table, the faces of his employees, the lawyer in the corner, everything dissolved into a blurry haze. The only thing in focus was her. Her face, a face he knew with an intimacy that was a decade old, a face that had haunted his dreams and his worst memories. His breath hitched in his throat, a sharp, painful gasp. The blood in his veins, which had been racing with anxiety, ran cold and heavy, a thick, icy sludge. It was Ava. Woman he had publicly fired, the person he had humiliated in front of their entire team, was now walking into the room as the new owner of his company. The shock was a tidal wave that crashed over him, stealing the breath from his lungs and the strength from his legs. He felt the blood drain from his face, the smug mask he had worn for months shattering into a million pieces. His mind screamed in a silent, desperate panic. This can't be real. This is a nightmare. This is some sick, cosmic joke. Ava's gaze swept over the room, acknowledging the stunned faces, the looks of disbelief, the small, triumphant smiles from those who had always believed in her. Her eyes held a calm, professional fire, completely devoid of the hurt he had expected. But she did not look at him, not yet. She walked with a purpose that was both elegant and terrifying. He watched her walk past him. The space between them, once a chasm of his own making, now felt like a final, damning judgment. She didn't flinch, she didn't even acknowledge his existence. Her path was to the head of the table, to the chair he had so arrogantly occupied just moments before. As she passed him, a subtle, almost imperceptible scent, a light floral perfume he had once loved, wafted over him, a cruel ghost from their shared past. It was a detail that broke through the haze of his shock, grounding him in the agonizing reality of the moment. She reached the chair and with a practiced, fluid motion, turned and sat down. Her eyes finally met his, and in that moment the entire universe seemed to shrink to just the two of them. The look in her eyes wasn't one of revenge, not yet. It was a look of cold, dispassionate authority, mingled with a quiet, powerful knowledge. She knew the irony of the situation, the poetic justice of his position. He was a statue, frozen by a terror he had never before experienced. He was no longer the king of his tech kingdom. He was an employee, and she was his boss. Ava took a small, deliberate breath, her hands resting calmly on the table. She looked out at the stunned faces of her new team, her gaze finally settling back on the man standing, motionless, at her side. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice clear and commanding. Her eyes, however, never left Marcus's. "My name is Ava, and I am the new owner of this company. I believe we have some changes to discuss." The silence in the conference room was a living, breathing entity, heavier and more potent than any sound. It was the silence of 1,000 unspoken thoughts, a collective held breath. Ava, now seated at the head of the long table, the very position Marcus had so recently occupied with such arrogant certainty, allowed her gaze to sweep over the stunned faces of her new employees. Her eyes settled on each person in turn, seeing not just employees, but individuals who had been forced to witness an act of petty cruelty. She saw the relief on Alina's face, the subtle, knowing nod of her former mentor who had likely been a silent ally all along. She saw the wide-eyed, almost triumphant expression of the young intern who had gasped on the day she was fired. She saw the fear and uncertainty in the eyes of others, the ones who had either stayed silent or, worse, had offered a quiet nod of agreement to Marcus's lies. She remembered the faces, the looks of pity in the averted gazes, and in that moment the injustice she had felt turned into a quiet, burning resolve. This was her company now, and she would not lead it with fear, but with respect. Then her gaze landed on Marcus. He was a statue carved from disbelief and terror. The smirk he had worn on the day he fired her, the confident posture he had held just moments ago, were both gone. His face, drained of all color, was a roadmap of sheer, unadulterated shock. His mouth was slightly agape. His hands, which had been so confidently clasped behind his back, were now hanging limply at his sides. He was a deer in the headlights, caught in the blinding glare of a reality he had not just failed to foresee, but had actively and cruelly set in motion. Ava felt a strange mix of emotions. There was no joy in his terror, no wild sense of triumphant glee. There was simply a deep, profound sense of poetic justice. He had wanted to break her, to publicly humiliate her, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. She saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the dawning horror as he connected the dots, the unjust termination, the lawsuit she had filed, the settlement she had used as the down payment for this very company. He was now realizing that his petty act of revenge had been the catalyst for her grand, and now, ultimate success. Her own mind, however, was a whirlwind of memories and present reality. She remembered the cold fury of leaving the office that day, the feeling of walking with her dignity as her only shield. She remembered the long, grueling hours she had spent with her lawyer, the strategic planning, the slow but steady process of building her case, and ultimately, her new empire. The path from his cruel words to her current position had been long and arduous, but standing here now made every single step worth it. This was not about personal revenge. It was about the vindication of hard work, talent, and professional integrity. Marcus, however, was trapped in his own mental prison. His mind raced, desperately searching for an explanation, any explanation that didn't lead to the inescapable truth. Maybe it was a coincidence, a different Ava, a distant relative with the same name and a similar face. But no, the eyes were the same. He knew those eyes. They had once looked at him with love, then with disappointment, and now with an unsettling calm that was more terrifying than any rage. He felt a sickening drop in his stomach as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. The woman he had wronged was now the one who held his professional life in her hands. The karma was so swift, so complete, that it felt like an elaborate, brutal joke. He couldn't believe it. He wouldn't. He tried to speak, to utter some word of protest or disbelief, but the words were stuck in his throat, choked by a terror so complete it was a physical force. Ava's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It was not a cruel smirk, but a subtle, almost private acknowledgement of the moment. The look was a quiet conversation between the two of them, a message that said, "I always knew I was better than you, and now the world knows it too." She then turned her attention back to the room, her professional demeanor returning in full force. She was a leader, not a scorned lover seeking revenge. The time for that would come later, in private. For now, there was a company to run. She wanted her team to know that the reign of terror was over, that their jobs were safe, and that a new, more transparent and supportive era was beginning. Her presence alone had already done more to reshape the company culture than any of Marcus's attempts at intimidation ever could. She took a deep, fortifying breath and looked out at the faces of her new employees. "I know this must be a shock to many of you," she said, her voice clear and commanding, cutting through the heavy silence. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I can assure you that this acquisition is a positive step for everyone here. We're going to build a new, innovative future together." Her gaze, however, slowly drifted back to Marcus, still frozen in place. Her eyes held a mixture of professional authority and a deep, unspoken meaning. The business part of her speech was for everyone in the room. The look, that final, knowing glance, was just for him. Ava began her address with a calm, authoritative grace that belied the monumental shock she had just delivered to the room. The initial murmurs of disbelief had fallen into a pin-drop silence, and every eye was on her, waiting. "First, I want to thank all of you for your hard work," she began, her voice clear and measured. "I know this acquisition may have come as a surprise, but I can assure you it is a very positive step for this company and for every single person in this room. My vision is not to come in and disrupt everything. It's to build upon the incredible talent you already have and to create a company that leads with innovation, collaboration, and respect." As she spoke, Marcus was a silent, frozen wreck beside her. Every word she uttered felt like a personal indictment of his leadership. He had led with fear, she was promising collaboration. He had dismissed an employee's talent, she was vowing to build on it. His mind, still reeling from the shock of her identity, was now struggling to process the confident, articulate woman speaking before him. This wasn't the Ava he had known. The woman he remembered had been ambitious, yes, but this new version was a leader, a visionary who commanded a room with an effortless presence he could only dream of. The crushing realization that she was not just his professional equal, but his superior, began to sink in with a painful finality. Ava continued, detailing her plans with a precision that was both impressive and terrifying to Marcus. She spoke of investing in new technologies, creating mentorship programs, and most notably, fostering a culture of trust and open communication. The last phrase hit Marcus like a physical blow. He glanced at the faces of his employees and he saw the relief washing over them. They were listening intently, their initial shock giving way to a cautious, then a genuine hope. Ava wasn't a corporate overlord. She was a leader who saw them as assets, not as cogs in a machine. When her speech concluded, the room erupted not in applause, but in a collective sigh of relief. A few people nodded their heads in quiet support, and an encouraging murmur rippled through the conference room. Ava's address had done more than just inform them of an acquisition. It had restored a sense of security and purpose that Marcus's reign had systematically eroded. She had won their trust in a matter of minutes, a feat that had eluded him for months. "Thank you, everyone," Ava said, a warm, professional smile on her face. "You'll be hearing more from me and my team soon. For now, you're all dismissed. I'd like to ask Marcus to please stay behind." The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the heavy, fearful quiet Marcus had cultivated. It was an electric, anticipatory hush. As the employees filed out, many of them gave Marcus a final, knowing glance, a look that said, "Your time is up." Elinor offered Ava a small, almost imperceptible nod as she walked past, a silent act of support that Ava returned. Soon the room was empty. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed in the profound quiet, leaving Ava and Marcus alone at last. The long conference table, which had been the site of so many of his power plays, now felt like the stage for his final, humiliating performance. Ava's demeanor shifted subtly. The smile was gone, replaced by a serious, focused expression. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "Marcus," she said, her voice now softer than it had been in the meeting, but no less firm, "we need to talk." He found his voice, a pathetic, strangled sound that barely resembled his usual confident tone. "Ava, I don't know what to say." "Don't," she cut him off, her voice firm and direct. "Don't try to make excuses. Don't try to lie your way out of this. I'm not here as your ex-girlfriend. I'm here as the CEO of this company, and you are an employee who wrongfully terminated a key member of our team." Her directness was more devastating than any emotional outburst could have been. He was a cornered animal with no escape. The facade he had so carefully built crumbled entirely. He looked at her, truly saw her for the first time in over a decade, and saw not just a successful businesswoman, but the woman he had once loved, whose heart he had broken, whose ambition he had tried to crush. The years of resentment and bitterness that had fueled his actions seemed to suddenly, completely, and utterly disappear, replaced by a deep and profound shame. "I know what you did," she continued, her voice still calm, a chilling contrast to the turmoil on his face. "I know it wasn't about performance. I know it was a petty, bitter act born of a past you never moved on from. And what you don't know is that the lawsuit I filed for wrongful termination is what gave me the capital to acquire this company. Your attempt to ruin me was the very thing that led to this moment. You gave me the money to buy your company." Marcus's world spun. The irony was so complete, so brutal, that it stole the last breath of defiance from his lungs. The very act he had believed was his ultimate victory had been the first crucial step in her revenge, a revenge that wasn't emotional, but entirely professional and absolute. He sank into a chair, the fight completely gone from him. The man who had been a swaggering king just minutes ago was now a defeated, terrified shell. "I know you're not going to believe me," he said, his voice a broken whisper, "but I'm sorry, Ava, I'm sorry for everything. I was so lost in my own bitterness. I was so angry that you left me, and I took it out on you, in front of everyone. It was unforgivable." Ava looked at him, not with a triumphant smile, but with a quiet, sorrowful gaze. The man before her was not the monster she had imagined. He was simply a deeply broken, prideful man who had finally been forced to face his own worst demons. The confrontation wasn't over, but the final, honest confession had been made. The time for the past was gone, and the time for the future was about to begin. Marcus sat across the table from Ava, a defeated man in a room that had once been his kingdom. The silence that followed his broken admission hung heavy in the air, but it was a different kind of silence than the one that had filled the office during her firing. This was a silence of raw, exposed truth. He had confessed his sins, and now he waited for the verdict. I don't know why I did it, Ava," he began again, his voice barely a whisper. "No, that's a lie. I know exactly why I did it. I've spent the last 10 years telling myself a story where you were the villain, where you left me for your career, where you were cold and ambitious and never truly cared about me. I convinced myself that the moment you walked out the door, you had forgotten about us, about everything we built. I was so consumed with that pain, that bitterness, that I thought the only way I could ever get over it was to make you hurt as much as I did." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a decade's worth of regret. "I saw your resume, all your accomplishments, and all I could see was a list of all the things you had done since you left me. Every one of your successes felt like a personal rejection. When I got promoted to this position, when you ended up on my team, I thought it was fate. I thought it was my chance to finally get my revenge, to show you that I was the one who had made it. Firing you in front of everyone, it felt like the ultimate victory. I thought it would finally make me feel whole again." He finished, and the room was silent once more. He had laid bare the ugly, insecure truth of his actions, and he felt a strange sense of emptiness. The confession hadn't brought him the catharsis he might have expected. It had simply solidified the shame. Ava listened to it all, her expression unreadable, her face a serene mask. She looked at him, not with the anger or disgust he deserved, but with a profound, almost heartbreaking sadness. She recalled the same memories he had just described, but from her perspective. She remembered their small apartment, the late-night talks about their dreams, and the fierce, protective love she had felt for him. She had never been a cold, ambitious careerist. She had been a young woman in love, with an ambition she had hoped they could share. "I didn't leave because I didn't love you, Marcus," she said, her voice soft but clear, her words cutting through the haze of his self-delusion. "I left because I had a chance at a career-defining opportunity, a chance that you never supported. Do you remember when I got the offer to go to San Francisco to work on that groundbreaking AI project? It was my dream, the kind of opportunity people wait their whole lives for." Marcus nodded slowly, the memory coming back to him with a fresh, painful clarity. He had dismissed it as a distraction, a phase she would get over. He had told her that their life was here with him, that a real relationship meant making sacrifices. "I wasn't asking you to give up your life for me," Ava continued, her voice full of the quiet pain of a decade. "I was asking you to support me, to be proud of me, and to maybe even consider coming with me. But you saw my success as a threat. You saw my ambition as a choice between you and my career. It wasn't. It was a choice between my future and a relationship that was holding me back, that was making me feel like I had to choose between being a good partner and being a fulfilled person." The truth, a truth he had refused to see for so long, now stared him in the face, a devastating, unassailable fact. He hadn't been the wronged party, he had been the one who pushed her away. His insecurity had convinced him that her love was a finite resource, one that would be spent on her career instead of on him. He had been so consumed with his own pain that he had completely misinterpreted her actions, turning her brave leap of faith into a personal betrayal. "You were so focused on your own pain that you couldn't see mine," Ava said, her voice filled with a final, sorrowful empathy. "I loved you, Marcus. Leaving was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, but I knew that if I stayed, I would have lost a part of myself. I would have ended up resentful, and we would have both been miserable. My departure wasn't a choice to leave you, it was a choice to save myself." He hung his head, the weight of her words a physical burden. The revenge he had so desperately sought had been a complete and utter waste, a vicious act built on a foundation of a lie he had told himself. He hadn't won. He had lost everything a decade ago, and now he was faced with the living, breathing proof of his own failure. He had been so wrong about everything. He had tried to break her, and in doing so, he had only exposed his own fragility. Ava leaned back in her chair, the weight of the conversation seeming to settle on her as well. "I didn't come back here for revenge, Marcus," she said, her voice now a mix of exhaustion and resolve. "I came back here to save a company I know is full of brilliant people, people just like I once was. And I came back here because your petty act of revenge was the very thing that showed me that I could be a success without you, that I could stand on my own. I took the settlement you gave me, and I used it to take the first step toward this moment. You didn't break me, you built me." He looked at her, truly seeing the woman she had become, strong, confident, and with a quiet dignity he had never possessed. The man he had been was now gone, replaced by a hollow shell of shame and regret. The confrontation was over. The truth had been revealed. The past had been laid to rest, but the hard work of the future was just beginning. Ava leaned back in her chair, the weight of the conversation seeming to lift from her shoulders as she saw the last vestiges of Marcus's arrogant bravado melt away. She had not come back to gloat or to tear him down, but to lay bare the truth and offer a path forward, a path he had to choose for himself. "I told you that your petty act of revenge was what allowed me to acquire this company," she began, her voice calm and clear. "It's the truth. When you fired me and the world saw your cruelty, my lawyer and I knew we had a slam-dunk case. The settlement we received from the company was substantial, but what was more important was the fire it lit in me. It showed me that I couldn't just be a brilliant employee anymore. I had to be a brilliant leader. That money wasn't a payout for my pain. It was the seed capital for my next chapter." Marcus listened, his mind reeling. He remembered the lawsuit, the panicked meetings with corporate lawyers, and the quiet, out-of-court settlement that they had all hoped would make the problem go away. He had never considered that the money he had been so angry to have to pay, was now the very reason she was sitting across from him. The profound irony of the situation was a physical blow, a humbling reality check that shattered his worldview completely. He had been so focused on being a winner that he hadn't realized he had become a pawn in his own downfall. "I didn't come back here to seek revenge," Ava continued, her expression softening into a look of quiet sincerity. "I came back to prove to you, and more importantly to myself, that I could be a success entirely on my own terms. My goal was never to tear down what you had built, but to build something better with the foundation you'd already laid. I'd always seen the potential in you, Marcus. I saw the passionate, brilliant man who loved to code, who saw the elegant solution in a complex problem. The man who had big dreams, a man whose ambition I used to admire so much." She paused, her gaze filled with a distant sadness. But somewhere along the way, that man got lost. He was consumed by his own insecurities and allowed his pride to poison his ambition. The man who publicly humiliated me isn't the man I once loved. He's a shadow of that person, a man whose professional worth has been completely eclipsed by his personal pain. Ava leaned forward, her tone now turning from reflective to decisively professional. "I know what you're thinking," she said, cutting off his pathetic attempt to speak. "You're expecting me to fire you, to get my own revenge. And honestly, it would be the easy thing to do. It would be a mirror image of your own actions, a satisfying conclusion to this moment. But I'm not going to fire you. Firing you would be a petty, emotional decision, and I am here to be a leader who makes rational, professional choices. I'm not going to repeat your mistakes." Marcus looked up, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope igniting in his chest. "But your position as regional director has been eliminated," she stated, her voice firm. "You've proven that you're not equipped to lead a team with empathy and respect. You've created a toxic culture of fear that I intend to dismantle. However, I believe that the man I once loved is still in there somewhere, buried beneath years of bitterness and pride. I'm going to give you a chance to prove me right." She laid out the new terms, which were humbling and utterly without fanfare. He would be demoted to a senior software developer, reporting directly to her. His salary would be adjusted to reflect the change in position. He would no longer have any direct reports and would be working on a new project that required deep technical expertise and collaboration. He would also be on a probationary period, a professional trial that would hold him accountable for his performance and his demeanor. "You have to earn your place here, Marcus," she said, the finality of her words ringing in the quiet room. "Just like everyone else, your past accomplishments won't save you. Your pride won't save you. Only your work and your willingness to change will. You have two options. You can take this offer or you can walk away. The choice is yours. There is no middle ground." Marcus sat there, utterly defeated but also strangely at peace. The weight of his arrogance, of his pretense, was gone. He saw the path forward, a long, difficult road back to the man he had once been. He would be working for the woman he had wronged, in a position of authority he had once so casually tossed aside. It was the ultimate, deserved humiliation. But beneath the humiliation was a promise, a genuine second chance. He looked at Ava not as the woman he had once loved or the woman who had now vanquished him, but as a leader, a fair, firm, and surprisingly compassionate one. He had tried to break her with a single cruel act, and in return she was offering him a chance at redemption. He took a deep breath, his head bowed in a silent act of surrender and acceptance. "I'll take it," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Thank you, Ava." The confrontation was over. The hard work was about to begin. The months that followed the bombshell meeting were a profound and challenging period of change for everyone at the company. For Marcus, the first few weeks were a brutal exercise in humility. He had spent years in a position of power, and now he was back in a cubicle stripped of his authority, a senior programmer on a team he once managed with an iron fist. The silence of his former subordinates was palpable, a mix of awkwardness and quiet resentment. They saw him not as a leader, but as the man who had wronged their respected colleague. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost haunting his own past. He spent the first few weeks simply doing his job, burying himself in the new code Ava had assigned him. The work was challenging and, to his surprise, deeply satisfying. He had forgotten the pure joy of solving a complex technical problem, a joy that his years of micromanagement and power-mongering had completely eclipsed. But the hardest part wasn't the work, it was the people. He had to learn to collaborate, to ask for help, and most difficult of all, to offer apologies. His first apology was to Kyle, the young, eager programmer who had taken over Ava's desk. Marcus had seen him as a simple placeholder, a sycophant to control. He found Kyle working late one evening, struggling with a particularly difficult bug. Marcus, in a moment of true humility, offered to help. After they solved it together, Marcus looked at him with an honest, regretful expression. "Kyle," he said quietly, "I want to apologize. The way I brought you in here, the way I ran things. It wasn't right, and the way I treated Ava was inexcusable. I was a terrible boss, and I am truly sorry." Kyle, stunned, simply nodded, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. It was a small moment, but for Marcus, it was a turning point. From that day forward, Marcus began to rebuild. He offered to mentor junior employees, shared his extensive knowledge without seeking credit, and always listened more than he spoke. The respect he was slowly earning was nothing like the fear-based deference he had once commanded. This was a genuine, hard-won respect born of his actions, not his title. He was becoming a colleague, an equal, and in doing so, he was finally becoming the man he was always meant to be. Meanwhile, Ava was a force of nature. She had not returned to exact revenge, but to build a new kind of company, one founded on the principles she so strongly believed in. She dismantled the toxic culture of fear with a quiet, steely resolve. She introduced an open-door policy, launched a series of mentorship programs, and most importantly, created a supportive environment where employees were encouraged to take risks, learn from their mistakes, and innovate. She made it clear that her leadership was about empowerment, not control. The company flourished under her direction. The creative spark that had been lost was reignited. Projects were completed ahead of schedule, not out of fear, but because people felt a genuine sense of ownership and pride in their work. Ava's leadership was fair, decisive, and kind. She saw the best in her employees and gave them the tools to succeed, and in return, they gave her their loyalty and their best work. Her professional relationship with Marcus was a fascinating and delicate dance. They had regular check-ins, but their conversations were always strictly professional. She never brought up the past, and he never brought up their present as anything other than a business arrangement. She saw his effort, his humility, and the genuine good in his actions. She saw him not as the man who had wronged her, but as a skilled employee who had been given a second chance and was taking full advantage of it. The pain of the past was no longer a fresh wound, but a distant scar, a memory that had shaped them both but no longer defined them. The happy ending for Marcus wasn't a return to power or a rekindled romance. It was something far more profound. He had rediscovered his passion for coding and the simple satisfaction of a job well done. He had found a new kind of happiness in the camaraderie of his team, in the quiet sense of accomplishment that came from helping a junior programmer, or the simple nod of respect from a colleague in the hallway. The prestige, the power, and the title he had once so desperately chased were all hollow ambitions he was finally free of. He realized that the man he had been was a prisoner of his own insecurity, and the man he was becoming was finally, truly free. As for Ava, her happiness wasn't dependent on Marcus's redemption. She was a successful CEO, a fair leader, and a fulfilled person. She had built a thriving company, surrounded herself with brilliant, motivated people, and found a deep sense of purpose in her work. The quiet, professional peace she had found with Marcus was simply a bonus, a final, satisfying closure to a painful chapter of her life. The story culminated one late Friday afternoon, a quiet echo of the day it had all begun. Marcus was working late, helping a junior programmer troubleshoot a complex issue, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitor. Ava, on her way out of her office, paused by his desk. She didn't say a word, she simply watched him work, saw the way his face was alight with concentration and passion. He looked up, caught her eye, and a brief, knowing smile passed between them. It was a smile that held no bitterness, no regret, no desire for what could have been. It was a smile of mutual respect and of a shared, hard-won peace. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval, and he returned to his work. The company was flourishing, and so was Marcus. He had his job, a chance to prove himself, and the respect of his team, all thanks to the woman he had once tried to destroy, the woman who, in her own way, had saved him.